When my husband walked through the door with strangers smiling behind him, I realized some secrets don't explode. They wait patiently for the right day to breathe. It was my birthday. Not just any birthday, but one of those milestone years people whisper about, the kind that makes you take inventory of your life whether you want to or not. I had woken up that morning with the strange calm that comes from believing you know exactly what your day will hold. Coffee at the kitchen table, a few polite phone calls, maybe dinner out, just the two of us like always. I remember standing at the bathroom mirror, smoothing a hand over the faint lines at the corners of my eyes, thinking how time had been both kind and cruel. Kind enough to give me a home, children, a marriage that looked solid from the outside, cruel enough to leave quiet spaces I'd learned not to examine too closely. By late afternoon, the house smelled like vanilla and lemon cleaner. I'd wiped down the counters twice, not because they were dirty, but because my hands needed something to do. The cake sat on the dining table, store-bought, modest, frosted with pale pink roses. I'd told my husband not to make a fuss. He never did anyway. I was lighting the candles when I heard the front door open. Not the familiar sound of just one set of footsteps. There was a pause, then more shoes on the tile. Laughter, nervous, unsure, a woman's voice I didn't recognize, pitched too high, trying to sound cheerful. I turned around with the lighter still in my hand. My husband stood there stiffly, his shoulders pulled back the way they were when he was bracing for something unpleasant. Beside him was a woman about my age, maybe a few years younger, her hair carefully styled, her smile trembling at the edges. And behind her, 3 grown children, 2 men and a woman, all of them watching me like I was the surprise, not them. "Happy birthday," my husband said. The lighter clicked uselessly between my fingers. For a moment, no one moved. The air felt thick, like before a summer storm. I remember noticing small things, the scuff on one man's shoe, the way the youngest woman clutched her purse to her chest, the faint smell of cologne that didn't belong to my husband. "This is unexpected," I said finally. My voice sounded steady, even to me. My husband swallowed. He needed to talk. The cake candles melted slightly, wax bending under their own heat. That was how it began. Not with shouting, not with tears, just a room full of people who didn't belong to me standing in my home on the day I'd been born. Later, I would replay that moment again and again, wondering how many times they had rehearsed this walk through my door, how long he had been planning to tell me, or if he ever truly planned to at all. But that evening, all I knew was that something in my life had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. Before I tell you what he said next, you need to understand the man I married and the woman I was before I learned how much silence can hide. My husband and I had been married for over 30 years. We met young, back when dreams were big and bank accounts were small. He was charming in a reserved way, not loud, not flashy, but dependable. The kind of man who fixed leaky faucets without being asked and remembered to lock the door every night. I mistook consistency for safety. Maybe it was. Our life settled into routines quickly. He worked long hours. I learned to make dinner that reheated well. We raised children who learned early how to read the mood of a room. We attended school plays, funerals, anniversaries. We smiled for photographs and argued quietly behind closed doors, never about anything that felt worth burning the house down over. There were absences, of course, business trips that ran long, phone calls he took outside, birthdays he forgot and apologized for later with flowers and that sheepish grin. I noticed, but I didn't press. I told myself that marriage was about choosing peace over suspicion. The house we lived in was filled with proof of a shared life, family photos lining the hallway, mismatched furniture accumulated over decades, a crack in the ceiling we always said we'd fix. On Sunday mornings, the smell of coffee and toast drifted through the rooms like a promise that nothing was wrong. And for the most part, nothing ever seemed wrong enough to question. Still, there were moments, small, quiet moments, when something felt off. A name he almost said but didn't, a look that lingered too long on strangers. I buried those moments the way women of my generation were taught to do, deep and without ceremony. By the time my birthday arrived that year, I believed I knew my life well enough to predict its every turn. That belief died the moment I saw those faces in my living room. My husband cleared his throat. The woman beside him took a step forward, then stopped as if she was unsure whether she was allowed to exist in my space. He should have told you sooner, all of you. All of you. That was the first time I understood, truly understood, that whatever this was, it wasn't new. It was old, carefully preserved, hidden in plain sight. And as I looked at them, at the family he had brought into my home on the day meant to celebrate my life, I felt something unexpected rise inside me. Not anger, not even heartbreak, but a calm so deep it frightened me. I smiled, and I reached for the small box I had placed on the sideboard earlier that day, wrapped neatly in silver paper, waiting for the right moment. When I picked up the box, my husband flinched. It was almost imperceptible, just a tightening of his jaw, a quick dart of his eyes. But after 30 years, I knew his body language better than my own. He thought the box was a weapon, an accusation, a trap. In a way, he wasn't wrong. "Sit down," I said gently. My voice carried the same tone I used when calming a frightened child or a nervous guest, polite, measured, almost kind. No one moved at first. The woman beside him, the other woman, glanced at the couch, then at my husband as if waiting for permission. The children followed her lead. That told me more than any confession could. This was not a spontaneous act of courage. It was a long-standing hierarchy, carefully maintained. My husband gestured stiffly. "Please, let's sit." We arranged ourselves like strangers at a funeral. My husband and the woman perched on the edge of the couch. The 3 children, adults really, took the armchairs and dining chairs, their knees angled toward the door. I remained standing for a moment, holding the box against my chest, feeling the steady beat of my heart through the cardboard. "Before you say anything," I said, "I want to be very clear about something." My husband opened his mouth. I raised my hand. "This is my birthday. You've taken enough from me today, so I will speak first." Silence fell. Even the clock in the hallway seemed to tick more quietly, as if it too was listening. I looked at each of them in turn. The woman's eyes were glassy, red-rimmed. She had the weary posture of someone who had waited a long time to be acknowledged. One of the sons, the oldest I guessed, stared at the floor with clenched fists. The daughter watched me carefully, curiosity warring with fear. "I'm not going to scream," I said. "I'm not going to throw things, and I'm not going to pretend this is the first time I felt something was wrong." My husband swallowed hard. "For 30 years," I continued, "I have shared a life with a man I believed I knew. I built a home, raised children, made sacrifices I never tallied because that's what partnership looks like. Today, you've brought me proof that I was only living half a story." The woman beside him let out a quiet sob and pressed her hand to her mouth. "She didn't know about you," she whispered suddenly. "Not at first, I swear." I nodded slowly. "I believe you." That surprised her. It surprised my husband, too. "Because lies like this," I said, "don't survive 30 years without cooperation or silence." My husband leaned forward. "Please," he said, "let me explain." I finally sat down across from them, crossing my legs with deliberate calm. The box rested on my lap, its silver paper catching the light. "You'll have your turn," I said, "but first I want you to listen." I drew in a breath, steady and deep. "I knew something was wrong long before today," I said. "Not everything, not the scope of it, but enough." My husband's head snapped up. "You did?" "Yes," I replied. "Women don't live beside men for decades without learning the difference between privacy and secrecy." I told them about the missed anniversaries, the business trips that never quite added up, the way his phone was always face down. I spoke of nights I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, wondering why loneliness felt so familiar even in a full bed. I told myself stories, that you were tired, that I was imagining things, that good marriages don't question every shadow. I looked directly at my husband then. But I never stopped watching. The box felt heavier in my hands now. "About 10 years ago," I said, "I found something." His face drained of color. It wasn't dramatic, no lipstick on a collar, no secret emails, just a medical bill in the mail, addressed to you, but not to this house. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "I called the number on the bill," I said. I told myself it was a mistake, that there was a simple explanation. The other woman's breathing grew shallow. "And that's when I learned your name," I said, turning to her, "and the city you lived in, and that my husband had listed himself as a father on 3 birth records." The daughter gasped softly. My husband buried his face in his hands. "I didn't confront him," I said quietly. "Why?" one of the sons asked, his voice tight. I considered him for a moment. "Because I needed to know who I was before I decided who he was to me." They all stared at me, unsure what that meant. "For years," I said, "I gathered pieces, not obsessively, carefully. I hired no detectives, I hacked nothing, I simply paid attention." I told them about the second phone I found hidden in a coat pocket, the holiday cards sent from a familiar handwriting, signed with first names only, the patterns of absence that lined up too neatly to be coincidence. I watched my children grow, I watched myself age, and I asked one question over and over again. I paused. What would justice look like without destroying myself in the process? The clock ticked loudly now, filling the space between us. "When I realized the truth," I said, "I had choices. I could leave quietly, I could confront him and beg for honesty, or I could wait." My husband looked up, eyes wild. "You planned this?" "I prepared," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." I reached into the box and lifted the lid. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes tied with a thin ribbon. "These," I said, "are copies, not originals." I handed the first envelope to my husband. "Bank statements, accounts you opened years ago, tuition payments, mortgage transfers." His hands shook as he opened it. The second envelope went to the woman. "Birth certificates," I said softly, "school records, proof of paternity." Her knees buckled slightly and she gripped the edge of the couch. The third envelope I placed on the table, untouched. "And this," I said, "is a letter." My husband looked up. "To whom?" "To myself," I replied, "written 5 years ago." I let the silence stretch. "In that letter," I said, "I promised myself 3 things: that I would not be cruel, that I would not lie, and that when the truth came out, because it always does, I would stand on my feet, not my knees." My husband's voice cracked. "I was going to tell you." "On my birthday?" I asked. He didn't answer. One of the sons stood abruptly. "This is sick," he said. "You used us, all of us." I nodded. "Your anger is justified."
The woman finally found her voice. "He said he was trapped," she said, tears spilling freely now. "He said leaving would destroy everyone." I turned to her fully then. "And staying didn't?" She looked away. "I didn't bring you here to punish you," I said. "I brought you here because secrets rot in the dark, and I am done carrying rot that isn't mine." I stood up slowly, my knees steady. The box was never meant to hurt. I met my husband's eyes one last time. It was meant to end something. I took my coat from the chair, slipped my arms into the sleeves. "I have already filed the paperwork," I said calmly. "The house is in my name, always has been. The accounts you used are documented. Your children, all of them, will not suffer financially because of your choices. That was important to me." My husband stood, panic etched into every line of his face. "You can't just walk away." I smiled sadly. "I walked away years ago. Today, I'm just letting you see it." I opened the door, the cool evening air rushing in like a blessing. Behind me, a family sat in the wreckage of one man's silence. Ahead of me was something I hadn't felt in a long time. Space.
I didn't drive anywhere special that night. I just drove. The sky had already darkened, that deep indigo blue that comes before true night settles in. Streetlights flickered on one by one, and for the first time in decades, no one knew where I was going or when I'd be back. The thought should have frightened me. Instead, it loosened something in my chest. I parked a few streets away from the house and turned off the engine. The silence inside the car was different from the silence at home. This one didn't accuse me of anything. It simply existed. My hands rested on the steering wheel longer than necessary. They weren't shaking. That surprised me most of all. People like to imagine moments like that as explosive, sobbing, screaming, collapsing under the weight of betrayal. But grief doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moves in quietly, sits beside you, and waits to be acknowledged. I rested my forehead against the wheel and closed my eyes. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who believed love was proven by endurance, the woman who measured her worth by how much discomfort she could tolerate without complaint. I wanted to tell her something, but the words wouldn't come yet. Eventually, I started the car again and drove to a small hotel near the river. I'd stayed there once before for a conference years ago. It smelled faintly of linen detergent and old wood, and the lobby was empty except for a young clerk who didn't ask questions. I signed my name, took the key, and rode the elevator alone. In the room, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the muted sounds of other lives through the walls, a television murmuring somewhere, footsteps down the hall, laughter drifting faintly from a balcony. The world, it seemed, had not ended. I took off my shoes carefully, lined them up by the door, and lay back on the bed fully clothed. The ceiling fan turned slowly above me, its rhythmic hum grounding me in my body. That was the first night in years I slept without waiting for a key in the lock. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the thin curtains. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. Then memory returned, not as a blow, but as a settled truth. I showered, letting the hot water run over my shoulders longer than necessary. I watched strands of gray hair slide down the drain and felt oddly grateful for them. They were proof of survival. When I checked my phone, there were messages waiting. My husband had called 6 times, left 3 voicemails. His voice grew more frantic with each one, apologies tangled with explanations, promises layered on top of panic. I didn't listen to the last message. There were texts, too, from our children, confused, concerned. One simple message from my daughter stood out. "Are you okay?" I stared at it for a long time before replying. "I will be," I typed. "We need to talk soon." I spent the rest of the morning doing something radical. Nothing. I drank coffee slowly. I walked along the river and watched ducks glide through water that didn't care about my personal catastrophe. I ate lunch alone and noticed how food tasted different when I wasn't rushing to be back for someone else. In the afternoon, I called my lawyer. He had been expecting me. "I received your documents," he said after we exchanged pleasantries. "You were thorough." "I had time," I replied. We discussed next steps, practical things, dates, forms, boundaries. He didn't ask why I waited so long. Good lawyers, like good friends, understand that timing is personal. By the time I returned home that evening, the house felt altered. Not empty, just quieter, like it had exhaled after holding its breath for decades. My husband was there, sitting at the dining table, alone. The cake was gone. The candles sat melted into crooked shapes on a plate. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders slumped, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. He stood when he saw me. "Where did you go?" he asked, his voice raw. "Out," I said. "I needed air." "You didn't answer my calls." I wasn't ready to listen. He nodded, swallowing. "They left. I already knew who they were. I assumed they would." "They were angry," he said quietly, "at me." I took off my coat and hung it carefully. "They should be." He flinched. We stood there, facing each other across the table that had once held family dinners, homework sessions, and quiet arguments resolved through avoidance. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. I pulled out a chair and sat down. Intent doesn't erase impact. He rubbed his hands together nervously. "I loved you." "I don't doubt that," I said, "but love without honesty is just control dressed up nicely." That stung him. I could see it in the way his eyes filled, the way he looked away. "You didn't know how to stop," he whispered. "That's the lie you told yourself, not me." He looked up sharply. "You really knew all this time?" I knew enough, and I chose not to expose it until I could do so without destroying myself. He laughed bitterly. "You destroyed me instead." I met his gaze evenly. "You did that. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences." Silence settled between us again. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we disentangle." I told him that I would be staying in the house until arrangements were finalized, that we would speak to the children together, calmly, truthfully, that there would be no public spectacle from me, no social media confessions, no whispered gossip initiated on my end. "But, make no mistake, I will not lie for you." He nodded slowly. "I don't expect you to." That night, he slept in the guest room. I slept in my bed, alone, staring at the familiar ceiling and noticing how different it felt to occupy the space fully. The days that followed were measured and deliberate. We told our children first, sat them down in the living room where they had once played with toys and later sprawled with textbooks. My husband spoke haltingly. I filled in gaps when necessary, careful to state facts without venom. There were tears, raised voices, long silences. "I don't understand," my son said finally. "How could you do this for so long?" My husband had no good answer. He said he was afraid, that he compartmentalized, that he convinced himself everyone was better off not knowing. I watched my children absorb the truth, watched their image of their father fracture and rearrange itself. It hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated, not because they were angry, but because they were grieving a man they thought they knew. Afterward, my daughter hugged me tightly. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. I held her and breathed in the familiar scent of her shampoo, grounding myself in the knowledge that some things are still real and solid. News travels quickly in small circles. Friends called, some cautiously, some with outrage on my behalf. A few admitted they'd suspected something but hadn't known to tell me. I thanked them all and kept my dignity intact. I did not rant, I did not embellish. I told the truth once and let it stand on its own. My husband's reputation shifted quietly, not ruined, just altered. People looked at him differently now. Trust, once cracked, never quite returns to its original shape.
The other woman reached out to me one afternoon. Her message was hesitant, apologetic. "I don't know what to say. I never wanted to hurt you." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I believe you," I wrote. "I hope you find peace. I truly do." And I meant it. What surprised me most was how little anger I felt. Sadness, yes, fatigue, a deep bone-level tiredness, but not rage. Anger, I had learned, requires energy I no longer wished to give him. As the weeks passed, routines changed. I took up walking in the mornings. I cleaned out closets I had avoided for years, discarding items that no longer belonged to the woman I was becoming. I cooked meals I liked without considering anyone else's preferences. In one afternoon, I called my lawyer. He had been expecting me. "I received your documents," he said after we exchanged pleasantries. "You were thorough." "I had time," I replied. We discussed next steps, practical things, dates, forms, boundaries. He didn't ask why I waited so long. Good lawyers, like good friends, understand that timing is personal. By the time I returned home that evening, the house felt altered. Not empty, just quieter, like it had exhaled after holding its breath for decades. My husband was there, sitting at the dining table, alone. The cake was gone. The candle sat melted into crooked shapes on a plate. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders slumped, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. He stood when he saw me. "Where did you go?" he asked, his voice raw. "Out," I said. "I needed air." "You didn't answer my calls." I wasn't ready to listen. He nodded, swallowing. "They left. I already knew who they were. I assumed they would." "They were angry," he said quietly, "at me." I took off my coat and hung it carefully. "They should be." He flinched. We stood there, facing each other across the table that had once held family dinners, homework sessions, and quiet arguments resolved through avoidance. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. I pulled out a chair and sat down. Intent doesn't erase impact. He rubbed his hands together.
The first real crack in my composure came on a Tuesday morning, weeks after everything had been laid bare. It wasn't triggered by a phone call or a memory or even a conversation about the divorce. It was a sock, one of his socks, navy blue, worn thin at the heel, folded neatly at the back of the drawer like it had been waiting for me. I stood there holding it, my fingers brushing over the softened fabric, and something inside me finally gave way. I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet, body-racking sobs that come when you're tired of being strong. I cried for the years I had protected a lie without knowing it, for the birthdays that had passed unnoticed, for the version of myself that had believed patience was the same thing as loyalty. When the tears stopped, I folded the sock and placed it in a box labeled "Donate." The act felt ceremonial, like closing a door gently instead of slamming it. That was how most days unfolded then, not in explosions, but in small reckonings. My husband and I moved around each other carefully, like furniture being rearranged in a familiar room. He spoke softly, I listened when necessary. We discussed logistics with a civility that surprised even us. He never asked for forgiveness outright. That, at least, I respected. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old documents, I found our wedding album. The cover was worn at the edges, the binding loose. I opened it slowly, half expecting the photographs to accuse me of something. We looked young in those pictures, hopeful, so certain of who we were and what love would demand of us. I closed the album and set it aside. Memory, I realized, is not an obligation. You're allowed to remember without staying. The first time I ran into someone from his other life was by accident. I was at the grocery store, standing in the produce aisle, comparing avocados like I had all the time in the world. I sensed someone watching me and looked up. It was the daughter. She froze when our eyes met, her hand hovering over a basket of apples. For a moment, neither of us moved.
Then she took a tentative step forward. "Mrs. she began, then stopped. "I don't know what to call you." I smiled faintly. "My name is fine." She nodded, relief flickering across her face. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything." Her voice trembled, but there was sincerity there. Youth, too. She had inherited her father's eyes, I noticed, but not his evasiveness. "I know this isn't your fault," she continued quickly. "I didn't know about you until recently. None of us did." "I know, and I don't blame you." She hesitated. "You handled it with a lot of grace." I almost laughed at that. Grace is often just another word for endurance. "Take care of yourself," I told her. She nodded, eyes bright, and walked away. As I selected my avocados, I felt a quiet release. The anger I'd been bracing for never came. Instead, there was a strange sense of completion, as if a circle had finally closed. The public consequences unfolded slowly. My husband's colleagues learned. Some distanced themselves, others offered awkward support, unsure where loyalty should land. He stopped attending certain gatherings. His world grew smaller, narrower, defined by the limits of his own making. Mine expanded. Friends invited me out, not out of pity, but curiosity. They wanted to know who I was beyond the role I'd played for so long. I joined them for coffee, for walks, for quiet dinners where conversation drifted easily without the weight of pretense. One evening, a friend asked me, "How are you really doing?" I thought about it before answering. "I'm learning how to listen to myself." She nodded, understanding. The legal process moved forward steadily. Paperwork signed, accounts separated, dates set. My lawyer marveled at my preparedness. "You're one of the calmest clients I've ever had," he said once. "That's because the storm already passed," I replied. The moment of true public reckoning came unexpectedly. It was at a community fundraiser we had attended for years. I almost didn't go, but something in me wanted to reclaim the space, to prove, to myself mostly, that I didn't need to hide. I arrived alone, wearing a simple dress, my posture straight. Conversations paused subtly as I entered. Eyes followed, then softened. My husband arrived later, alone as well. When he spotted me, he hesitated, then approached. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. I nodded. We sat together, not as a couple, but as two people sharing a long history. People noticed. Whispers stirred, then settled. Halfway through the evening, someone asked him a pointed question about his family. He faltered, glanced at me. "I have made mistakes, and I am facing them," he said quietly. That was all. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Later, as I stepped outside for air, a woman I barely knew touched my arm. "You're very strong," she said. I met her gaze. "I'm honest. There is a difference." At home, the house continued to change. Rooms emptied, drawers lightened, walls seemed to breathe. I repainted the bedroom a soft, warm color I'd always liked but never chosen because he found it too much. It felt like permission. One afternoon, my husband approached me with a folder in his hands. "These are letters," he said. "I wrote them over the years. To you. I never gave them to you." I looked at the folder, then back at him. "Why now?" "Because you deserve to know, and because I don't want to carry them anymore." I took the folder and placed it on the table without opening it. "I may read them, or I may not." He nodded. "That's fair." We stood there, two people who had once promised forever, now negotiating an ending with care. The final court date arrived quietly. I wore a navy suit. My hair was pinned back neatly. My hands were steady. When the judge spoke the words that legally ended our marriage, I felt a gentle release rather than devastation, like setting down a heavy bag after a long journey. Outside the courthouse, my husband lingered. "I hope you find happiness," he said. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a villain but a man who had chosen fear over truth for most of his life. "I hope you find honesty," I replied. It was not a curse, it was a wish. As I walked away, sunlight warmed my face. The world felt wide again, not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer living a borrowed life. After the divorce was finalized, people expected a transformation for me. They waited for reinvention, a dramatic haircut, a new city, a loud declaration of freedom. Some assumed I would date immediately, as if replacing one man with another was proof of recovery. Others expected bitterness, sharp words, a permanent edge to my voice. What they didn't expect was how ordinary my healing looked. Most mornings, I woke up early and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching the light shift across the walls. I listened to the house in its new quiet, not empty, but settled. The ticking clock, the distant hum of traffic, the sound of my own breathing, steady and unhurried. For the first time in decades, my days belonged entirely to me. I started volunteering at the community library on Tuesdays. It was nothing glamorous, shelving books, helping children find stories they loved, chatting with retirees who treated the place like a second home. But there was comfort in it, purpose without obligation. One afternoon, an elderly woman handed me a novel and said, "This one helped me when my husband died." I smiled politely and took it, thinking how loss wears many faces. Death, betrayal, silence, they all leave behind the same question: who am I now? I was still answering mine. My children visited often in those early months, each in their own way trying to stitch together a new understanding of family. My son came first. He stood in the doorway awkwardly, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the house as if expecting it to look different. "You okay?" he asked. "I am," I said truthfully. He hesitated. "I'm struggling with him." "I know," I replied. "You're allowed to." He exhaled slowly. "I keep thinking I should have noticed something, that I failed you." I shook my head. "You were a child, and later you were busy building your own life. This was never your burden." He nodded, eyes shining. "You're handling this better than I ever could." I reached out and squeezed his hand. "That's because I had time to prepare. You didn't." Healing, I had learned, is not a competition. It moves at different speeds for everyone it touches. My daughter came next, bringing homemade soup in quiet strength. We sat on the couch, legs tucked beneath us like we had when she was younger. "Do you hate him?" she asked softly. I considered the question carefully. "No," I said, "but I don't protect him anymore either." She nodded, understanding more than I expected. The letters my husband had given me sat untouched on the hall table for weeks. I passed them daily, my hand hovering once or twice, curiosity warring with instinct. Finally, on a rainy afternoon when the house felt particularly still, I opened the folder. The handwriting was unmistakably his, careful, controlled, restrained. The first letter was dated 25 years earlier. "I don't know how to tell you what I've done," it began. I read slowly, methodically, letter after letter, confessions tangled with justifications, guilt softened by self-pity, love expressed in fragments, always stopping short of full accountability. By the time I reached the last letter, my chest felt heavy, not with sorrow, but with clarity. He had loved me in the way he knew how, and the way he knew how had never been enough. I placed the letters back in the folder and returned it to the table. I didn't tear them up, I didn't keep them close. Some truths are meant to be acknowledged, not preserved. One evening, months later, I ran into him again. It was at a quiet cafe across town. I was reading by the window when I sensed a familiar presence. He stood a few feet away, unsure whether to approach. "Hello," he said finally. "Hello," I replied. He looked older, not aged by time, but by reckoning. There was humility in his posture now, an absence of the confidence he once wore like armor. "How are you?" he asked. "Well," I said. "And you?" He paused. "Learning." I nodded. That seems to be the theme. We talked briefly, neutral ground, weather, work, nothing personal. Before he left, he said, "I never thanked you." "For what?" "For not destroying me." I closed my book. "I didn't spare you for your sake. I spared myself." He absorbed that quietly. As he walked away, I felt no pull to follow him with my eyes. That chapter had closed cleanly and without regret. The true turning point came the day I stopped introducing myself through my past. It happened casually, almost accidentally. I was at a small gathering when someone asked, "So, what do you do?" For years, I would have answered with roles: wife, mother, supporter, partner. Instead, I said, "I'm discovering what I enjoy." The words surprised me with their ease. I took a painting class. I was terrible at it, and it delighted me. I planted herbs on the windowsill and learned their names. I traveled alone to a nearby town and spent an entire afternoon wandering without purpose. There was joy in the unclaimed hours. One night, as I sat on the porch watching fireflies blink in and out of existence, I thought about the box I had given my husband on my birthday. People often ask what was in it, expecting something dramatic, but the truth is simpler than they imagine. It wasn't revenge, it was evidence. Evidence that I had seen clearly, that I had chosen myself, that I had refused to let another person's deception define the rest of my life. Patience, I learned, is not passive, it is deliberate. I began speaking at small women's groups, not as an expert, but as a witness. I didn't tell them what to do, I told them what I had learned, that silence is not peace, that love without truth is loneliness, that waiting is only noble if it costs you your self-respect. After one talk, a young woman approached me, tears in her eyes. "How did you know when to act?" she asked. I smiled softly. When staying quiet started hurting more than speaking. She nodded, holding those words like a lifeline. On my next birthday, I did something different. I didn't host a gathering, I didn't bake a cake, I didn't wait for anyone else to mark the day. I woke up early, made myself coffee, and wrote a letter, not to my past, but to my future. I wrote about the woman I was becoming, about honesty, about boundaries, about choosing joy without apology. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in a small box, not to hide it, but to remind myself that I no longer needed surprises to claim my life. As the sun rose, warm and unassuming, I felt something settle into place. Not triumph, not bitterness, but a quiet, unshakable dignity.
There is a moment after a long illness when the body no longer aches, but still moves carefully, unsure whether the pain might return if it forgets itself. That was where I found myself in the months after everything settled, not broken, not fully healed, but alert, listening, aware that peace, like trust, must be lived into slowly. The world had resumed its rhythm around me. Seasons changed without ceremony. Leaves browned and fell. Winter pressed its quiet against the windows. Spring followed, unapologetic in its insistence on renewal. And still, every now and then, something small would catch me off guard. A man reaching for his wife's hand at the market, a couple laughing over coffee, a familiar cologne drifting past me in a crowd. None of it sent me spiraling anymore, but it reminded me that my life had divided itself into before and after, and that the woman in the after was still learning how to occupy her own skin. The public consequences of my husband's choices continued to unfold long after the paperwork was signed. His second family, now no longer hidden, struggled to reorganize themselves around a truth that had altered everything they thought they knew. The sons grappled with anger differently, one openly, one in silence. The daughter withdrew for a time, then resurfaced cautiously, as if unsure which parts of herself were still allowed to exist. I did not insert myself into their healing, but I did not turn away from it either. One afternoon, the woman, his other wife in all but name, asked if we could meet. I considered the request carefully. There was no obligation, no moral requirement, only a question. Would this bring clarity or reopen wounds best left closed? In the end, I agreed. We met at a quiet park just after lunch, the kind where the benches are worn smooth by years of waiting. She arrived early and stood when she saw me, folding her hands together like someone preparing to be examined. "Thank you for coming," she said. I nodded and sat across from her. "You wanted to talk." She inhaled shakily. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. I needed to see you as a person, not as an idea." I studied her face, the familiar lines of age, the tired eyes, the careful way she chose her words. For years, I had imagined her as a shadow, a rival, a threat. Now she was simply a woman who had built a life around a partial truth. "I won't pretend this hasn't been painful," I said, "for both of us." She nodded, tears pooling. "He told me he was separated emotionally, that you stayed for convenience, that you knew." My jaw tightened slightly, but my voice remained calm. Men often soften their lies so they can live with themselves. She flinched, but didn't argue. "I stayed," I continued, "because I believed in honesty even when it wasn't being offered to me. I stayed because I wanted to leave with my integrity intact." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know who I am without him." I understood that fear intimately. "You'll find out. It won't be graceful, but it will be yours." We sat in silence for a while after that, watching a child struggle to keep a kite aloft in a fickle wind. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "Not just for you, for myself." That, I realized, was the beginning of her own reckoning. We parted without promises, without absolution, but without hatred, and that felt like progress. Around that time, I noticed a subtle shift in how people spoke to me. Not with pity, not with caution, but with curiosity. They asked questions, not about the betrayal, but about me, my interests, my plans, my thoughts. It was as if I had become visible in a way I hadn't been before. One evening, while attending a small neighborhood dinner, someone said, "You seem lighter." I smiled. "That's what happens when you stop carrying secrets that aren't yours." They laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. There were moments, though, when grief resurfaced unexpectedly, not for the marriage itself, but for the version of myself that had existed inside it. I mourned the woman who had swallowed discomfort to keep peace, the woman who had learned to read silence as loyalty, the woman who had made herself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. I honored her quietly. One night I lit a candle and sat alone at the kitchen table. I spoke aloud, softly, as if she were sitting across from me. I said, "You did the best you could with what you knew. Now, rest." The flame flickered gently, and I felt something release. My children continued to adjust in their own ways. My son struggled with anger toward his father, sharp, unresolved, occasionally explosive. I listened without defending, without correcting. "You don't have to fix this," I reminded him. "You just have to feel it honestly." My daughter took a different path. She became contemplative, reflective. She asked questions about relationships, about boundaries, about how to know when love becomes compromise. One evening, as we washed dishes together, she said, "I'm afraid of ending up like you." I didn't take offense. "I hope you end up braver than I was, sooner." She smiled faintly. "I think you're brave now." "Now," I agreed. "Yes." There came a day, quiet, unremarkable, when I realized I hadn't thought about him at all. Not his lies, not his voice, not the life we had shared. The realization startled me more than any memory could have. Healing, I understood, isn't about forgetting. It's about loosening the grip. I began to imagine a future again, not in sweeping visions, but in small, grounded ways. I thought about downsizing the house, about traveling somewhere unfamiliar, about waking up beside no one and feeling content instead of lonely. I even entertained the possibility of love again, not urgently, not desperately, but as a concept that no longer frightened me. If it came, it would have to meet me where I stood, whole, aware, and unwilling to disappear for anyone. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside was a single page. I don't know if you remember me," it began. "We met briefly at a fundraiser last year. You said something that stayed with me. Honesty is quieter than people expect, but it changes everything." The writer went on to explain that she had confronted her own partner after years of unease, not because she had proof, but because she trusted herself. "Whatever happens," the letter ended, "thank you for reminding me that dignity is worth the risk." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box where I kept meaningful things, not memories of pain, but markers of growth. It felt like a ripple extending outward. As time passed, my husband faded into the background of my life. We remained civil for the sake of our children, cordial, distant. Once, during a shared holiday gathering, he caught my eye across the room and nodded, not in ownership, not in expectation, but in acknowledgement. That was enough. The final public consequence came quietly. He moved away. No announcement, no dramatic exit, just a relocation that felt like an exhale. When I heard, I felt no triumph, only relief. On the anniversary of the day he brought that family into my home, I did something deliberate. I invited a few close friends over for dinner. We cooked together, laughed, talked late into the evening. The house filled with warmth, not manufactured, not obligatory, but genuine. At one point, someone raised a glass. "To new chapters," they said. I lifted mine, and honest endings. As the night wound down and the last guest left, I stood alone in the living room and looked around. The walls held memories, but they no longer defined me. I did. Later, lying in bed, I thought again of that box I had handed my husband on my birthday. People often ask if I planned the timing deliberately. The truth is, I didn't choose the day for drama. I chose it for clarity. I wanted the truth to meet me at a moment when I was fully present in my own life, not distracted by youth, not dulled by routine. I wanted to receive it as a woman who knew her worth. And I did. If there is one lesson I carry forward, one truth I hold gently but firmly, it is this. Patience is not about waiting for someone else to change. It is about giving yourself time to become strong enough to choose differently. I didn't smile because I was unbroken. I smiled because I was ready. Ready to stop asking for honesty from someone unwilling to give it. Ready to reclaim the years ahead, not as compensation for what was lost, but as a continuation of who I had always been beneath the silence. There's a quiet moment that arrives after everything important has already been decided. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with relief or celebration. It simply settles in, like dust after a long road has finally gone empty. That moment found me one early morning, almost a year after my birthday, the day my marriage ended without a single plate being thrown. I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing a mug I'd already cleaned once, watching the sun rise through the window. The light hit the counter just right, warming the wood, softening the edges of the room. I realized then that I was no longer bracing for anything. No call, no confrontation, no emotional aftershock, just a morning that belonged entirely to me. And that was when I knew, not intellectually, not bravely, but quietly, that I was healed enough to move forward. Healing, I learned, does not mean erasing the past. It means the past no longer interrupts your present. I still remembered everything, the deception, the years layered with half-truths, the way my husband's voice trembled when he realized I was no longer protecting his secret. Memory didn't disappear, but memory had lost its power to command me. I could think of him without tightening my jaw. I could think of the other family without resentment curling in my chest. I could think of my younger self without shame. That felt like freedom. The house eventually sold. I had considered keeping it, clinging to its familiarity, its history, but something in me wanted a clean threshold, a doorway that had never heard my name spoken in lies. The day I handed over the keys, I walked through the empty rooms one last time. I touched the wall where our children's heights had once been marked in pencil. I paused in the bedroom where I had slept beside a man whose truth lived elsewhere. I stood in the living room where I had smiled and handed him the box. Instead of grief, I felt gratitude, not for the marriage, but for myself, for surviving it without losing my soul. I moved into a smaller place across town, sunlit, modest, quiet, the kind of home that doesn't echo with obligation. I chose the furniture myself, hung art I liked without compromise, painted the bedroom a color no one else needed to approve. The space reflected me, not a role, not a history, but a presence. My children helped me unpack. We laughed over mismatched boxes and missing screws. My son assembled furniture with exaggerated seriousness. My daughter arranged books by instinct rather than order. "This feels like you," she said, looking around. I smiled. "It is." The relationship I rebuilt most carefully was the one with myself. For years, I had trusted my endurance more than my intuition. I had mistaken silence for wisdom, patience for virtue, accommodation for love. That changed. I began listening to my body, the tightness in my chest, the heaviness in my stomach, the subtle signals I used to dismiss. I stopped explaining myself when I didn't owe anyone clarity. I said no without apology. Strength, I learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "Enough." People still asked me questions. They wanted to know how I had stayed so calm, how I hadn't screamed or collapsed or destroyed him publicly, how I could smile that day. I told them the truth. I didn't smile because I wasn't hurt. I smiled because I had already done my grieving in private. Grief delayed does not disappear. It matures. By the time the truth stood in my living room, I was no longer begging for answers. I was ready to close a door. There was no dramatic reconciliation with my ex-husband, no tearful apology that fixed everything. We spoke occasionally, mostly about our children. He never asked for another chance. Perhaps he sensed it wouldn't be offered. Perhaps he finally understood that love cannot survive where honesty refuses to live. The last time I saw him, truly saw him, was at our grandchildren's school performance. We sat several seats apart. When the applause rose, our eyes met briefly. There was no longing there, no bitterness, just recognition. We had both been changed by the truth, but only one of us had been freed by it. The other woman eventually moved on too. I heard through mutual connections that she returned to school, that she began working in a field she'd once abandoned, that she was learning who she was outside the shadow of a man who never fully belonged to her. I wished her well from a distance. Healing does not require closeness, only release. One evening, long after the dust had settled, I sat alone on my balcony with a cup of tea and thought about time. 30 years is a long time to share a life with someone. It is also a long time to underestimate yourself. I didn't view those years as wasted anymore. They had taught me patience, yes, but more importantly, they had taught me discernment. I now knew the difference between love and endurance, between peace and silence, between loyalty and self-erasure. Those lessons were not cheap, but they were mine. I did not rush into another relationship. I enjoyed my own company too much for that. I traveled alone, slowly, intentionally, made friends who knew me only as I was now. I laughed more freely, slept more deeply, trusted my instincts without needing validation. And when companionship eventually found me, gentle, unforced, respectful, I welcomed it carefully, not as a replacement, but as an addition. There's a difference between wanting someone and needing them to feel whole. I chose the former. On my next milestone birthday, I did something symbolic. I took out the box, the one that had once held evidence, documents, proof of truth long concealed. It was empty now. I placed a single item inside, a letter written in my own hand. In it, I thanked myself for waiting until I was strong, for refusing to become cruel, for choosing dignity over drama, for trusting that truth would come when I was ready to receive it. I sealed the box and placed it on a shelf, not as a reminder of betrayal, but as a testament to resilience. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. You do not owe anyone your silence. You do not have to expose the truth before you are ready, and you are allowed to wait, not in fear, but in preparation. Some people confuse patience with weakness. They're wrong. Patience is power when it is paired with self-respect. I didn't smile that day because I had won. I smiled because I was done losing myself. And now, as I sit here telling you this story, I am not bitter. I am not broken. I am not ashamed of the years I stayed. I am proud of the moment I stood. Life did not begin after the betrayal. It finally became honest. And that, I have learned, is where real peace lives. Before I let you go, I want to sit here with you for just a moment, because stories like mine aren't really about betrayal, not at their core. They're about what happens inside us when the truth finally stands in the light. They're about the years we spend doubting our own instincts, the times we stay quiet because peace feels safer than honesty, the moments we tell ourselves, maybe this is just how love works. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, I want you to know something gently, without judgment. You are not weak for staying. You are not foolish for trusting, and you are not late for choosing yourself. Sometimes strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, enough. So I'll leave you with this question, the kind Auntie May always asks from the heart. If the truth walked into your living room today, would you be ready to meet it standing up? Take your time with that answer. There's no rush. And if this story touched you, if it made you feel seen or understood or just a little less alone, stay here with us. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. Until next time, take care of your heart. Some things are worth waiting for, and you are worth the truth.